How does a man go from living in a cave as a political outcast to becoming one of the most powerful leaders on earth? This is the story of Xi Jinping. In 2022, Xi walked out before the world as China's leader for a historic third term, something no one had done since Mao Zedong. He had already abolished term limits, silenced rivals, and reshaped the Communist Party entirely in his image. Today, Xi stands as a figure with almost unchecked power, commanding a population of more than 1 billion people and directing the world's second-largest economy. But his journey to the top wasn't one of privilege and ease. It began with betrayal, exile, and humiliation under the same political system he would one day rule. The boy who once slept in a cave during Mao's Cultural Revolution would rise to control the same party that had destroyed his family. And to understand how that happened, we have to go back to the beginning, before Xi was even born, in the chaos of China's civil war. Because long before Xi Jinping became China's ruler, his family's destiny was already tied to the revolution that built the nation itself. It all began with a revolution that changed China forever. In the 1930s, Mao Zedong led a group of communist rebels fighting against the ruling Nationalist Party. The odds were impossible. The Red Army was starving, trapped, and surrounded. So they made a desperate escape that became legendary: the Long March. Thousands of soldiers and civilians walked for over a year across brutal terrain, enduring hunger, disease, and relentless attacks. Only a small fraction survived, but those who did were treated as heroes. Their loyalty to Mao became the foundation of the Communist Party's power. Among those who helped Mao during this struggle was a man named Zhongxun. He was brave, respected, and deeply loyal, a revolutionary who offered Mao refuge when the Red Army was nearly destroyed. That decision would shape his family's destiny for generations. After the Communists finally took control in 1949, Mao became the ruler of the new People's Republic of China. Zhongxun was rewarded with a high position in government, and his son Xi Jinping grew up in the elite circles of Beijing. But as Mao's grip on power tightened, loyalty meant nothing. Mao began purging even his closest allies, and no one was safe. By the time Mao launched his Cultural Revolution, Zhongxun, the man who had once saved Mao's army, was denounced as a traitor, publicly humiliated, imprisoned, erased from history. And with his father's fall, young Xi's privileged life shattered overnight. The son of a revolutionary hero was now branded an enemy of the people. And what came next would test him in ways no one could have imagined. When Mao's Cultural Revolution swept across China, chaos became the new law. Schools shut down. Millions were denounced as traitors. Even those who had helped build the revolution were not spared. Among them was Zhongxun, Xi Jinping's father. Once a powerful revolutionary and respected leader, he was dragged into the streets by the Red Guards, young zealots devoted to Mao's ideology. They forced him to wear a sign calling him a criminal. They shouted at him, humiliated him, and tore down everything his family had built. For 8 long years, Zhongxun was imprisoned in Beijing, and his son, 15-year-old Xi Jinping, paid the price too. He was expelled from his elite school, labeled the son of a traitor, and exiled to a remote countryside village. There, Xi lived in a cave carved into the side of a hill. He shoveled manure, carried buckets of water, and worked the fields by hand. He barely had enough food to survive. The cold nights, the backbreaking labor, and the humiliation defined his teenage years. And the man responsible for all of it was the same man his father had once protected, Chairman Mao. But somewhere in those years of exile, Xi began to change. He learned the rhythms of rural life, the importance of obedience, and the value of silence. He realized that in China, survival meant aligning yourself with power, not resisting it. That lesson would guide every move he made for the rest of his life. When Mao finally died and the Cultural Revolution ended, the country was broken. But for Xi, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one where power would no longer be his enemy. When Mao Zedong died in 1976, China was exhausted. The country had survived decades of famine, violence, and political chaos. Entire families had been torn apart, millions had died. People wanted change, and the Communist Party needed to make sure that no one ever held as much power as Mao did again. That change came through Deng Xiaoping, one of Mao's old comrades who had also been purged and later rehabilitated. Deng saw what dictatorship had done to China, and he wanted to rebuild the nation, not through control, but through reform. He introduced a new idea: collective leadership. Instead of one supreme ruler, power would be divided among a small group of top officials known as the Politburo Standing Committee. This structure was designed to prevent another Mao from ever emerging. Under Deng, China slowly opened its doors to the outside world. He loosened state control over the economy, encouraged private enterprise, and invited foreign investment. Factories started humming, cities began to grow, and millions of Chinese citizens escaped poverty. The nation transformed almost overnight, from an isolated communist state into a rising global powerhouse. But Deng's biggest legacy was his restraint. Even though he was the most influential man in China, he never gave himself the official title of leader. He refused to become another dictator. He shared power, and for nearly 3 decades after Mao's death, that system worked. China grew richer, more stable, and more confident. And for a time, it seemed the nightmare of absolute rule was over. But far from the political center of Beijing, a man named Xi Jinping was quietly watching and waiting. And he was about to use this system of shared power to build something far more dangerous. When the Cultural Revolution ended, Xi Jinping returned to Beijing a changed young man. He had seen what it meant to lose everything. He had lived as an outcast, worked as a farmer, and learned how power could destroy or protect. So, when he joined the Communist Party, it wasn't out of faith. It was out of survival. He knew that in China, the only way to be safe was to be inside the system, not outside it. But instead of chasing power in Beijing, Xi made an unusual move. He went to the countryside. While other ambitious officials fought for influence in the capital, Xi took leadership roles in poor, rural provinces where few wanted to go. First in Hebei, then Fujian, and later Zhejiang. He built a reputation as a disciplined, hard-working bureaucrat who followed orders and got results. He made friends with military leaders, gained the trust of party elders, and avoided scandals that had ruined many others. Every step looked quiet, even modest, but every move was strategic. He was climbing the ladder without drawing attention, building a network of loyal supporters across the country. His approach worked. By the mid-2000s, he had become governor, then party secretary, of some of China's most economically important regions. In Shanghai, after a corruption scandal had shaken the city's leadership, Xi was brought in to clean up the mess. He handled it calmly, without drama, and earned a reputation as a loyal problem solver who didn't challenge authority. That was exactly what the top leadership wanted. And in 2007, his patience finally paid off. Xi was promoted to the Politburo Standing Committee, the highest circle of power in China. He had done what no one expected, risen from the ashes of disgrace to the doorstep of China's throne. But Xi's rise was only beginning. What came next would transform him from a cautious bureaucrat into the most powerful man China had seen in generations. By 2007, Xi Jinping had spent nearly 2 decades working far from the spotlight. He had governed provinces, managed crises, and built alliances with both the military and the party elite. Now he was back in Beijing, and closer to absolute power than ever before. At the time, China's leadership was looking for its next successor. They needed someone stable, loyal, and uncontroversial, someone who wouldn't rock the boat. Xi fit that image perfectly. He was the son of a revolutionary hero, but his humble provincial background made him look grounded and obedient. He seemed like a safe choice, a man who would preserve the collective leadership Deng Xiaoping had designed. So, in 2012, when then General Secretary Hu Jintao stepped down, Xi Jinping was chosen as the new leader of China. What no one expected was how quickly he would change everything. Almost immediately, Xi began consolidating power. He took control of the Communist Party, the government, and the military, uniting all three under his authority. No modern Chinese leader had ever done that so swiftly. He spoke of reform, discipline, and moral renewal. But behind that rhetoric, he was building something far more ambitious, his own empire. Within a year, he was launching campaigns that would reshape China's political landscape. And with each step, the man once considered humble and quiet began to show a very different side. The moment Xi became China's leader, he began a ruthless campaign that would destroy his enemies, secure his dominance, and turn him into the most powerful man in China since Mao Zedong. When Xi Jinping took power, his message was simple: fight corruption, restore discipline, and strengthen the party. But behind that message was a different mission, a systematic purge of his rivals. Within months of becoming China's leader, Xi launched a massive anti-corruption campaign that swept through every level of government and the military. State media showed headlines of corrupt officials being removed and prosecuted. To the public, it looked like justice. To insiders, it was clear that Xi was quietly removing anyone who stood in his way. Hundreds of senior officials, generals, and provincial leaders were taken down. Some were accused of bribery. Others simply vanished from public life. Xi filled their positions with loyal supporters, people who owed their careers to him alone. The result was a leadership structure where every major decision, every policy, and every command flowed directly through Xi. His campaign also sent a message to the rest of the party. Loyalty was survival, and defiance meant destruction. Even the highest-ranking members of the Politburo Standing Committee weren't untouchable. Xi expanded his control over the Central Military Commission, ensuring the army's allegiance. He restructured the security services, placing trusted allies at every key post. Step by step, Xi dismantled the power-sharing system that Deng Xiaoping had built. By his second term, China no longer operated under collective leadership. It operated under one man. The age of shared power was over. The era of Xi Jinping had begun, but Xi's next move would go even further, not just controlling the system, but rewriting its very ideology to make himself untouchable. By his second term, Xi Jinping was no longer just China's leader. He had become the embodiment of the Chinese Communist Party itself. But he wanted something more: permanence. In 2021, Xi introduced a sweeping ideological doctrine called Xi Jinping thought. It wasn't just a set of policies, it was a declaration that his ideas, his words, and his vision would define China's future. The party formally adopted it into its constitution, placing Xi's name alongside Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping, the two most influential figures in China's modern history. With this move, Xi's authority became almost sacred. Questioning his policies meant questioning the party itself. And to make sure no one could challenge him, Xi eliminated the final barrier that had restrained every leader before him: the presidential term limit. In 2018, China's parliament voted to abolish it entirely, effectively allowing Xi to rule for life. The message was clear: China had a leader who intended to stay. Under his rule, censorship tightened, surveillance expanded, dissent vanished. Online platforms were flooded with propaganda promoting Xi as a visionary father figure, while schools began teaching his ideology to children as part of their curriculum. To the outside world, China appeared stronger than ever. Its economy had doubled in size. Military spending surged. Diplomacy grew bolder. But inside China, fear returned, the same fear that once defined Mao's rule. And the leader who had once lived in a cave now stood at the center of an empire built entirely around himself. Yet even the most powerful rulers face moments of reckoning, and Xi's would come not from his enemies, but from his own people. For years, Xi Jinping's rule seemed unshakable. He had silenced his critics, crushed opposition, and surrounded himself with loyalists. But in 2020, everything changed. When the COVID-19 pandemic hit, China enforced some of the harshest lockdowns on Earth. Entire cities were sealed off. People were trapped in their homes for weeks, sometimes months. At first, Xi's zero-COVID policy was praised as proof of his control and discipline, but as months dragged on, frustration turned into anger. Videos began circulating online showing citizens screaming from apartment windows, protesting in the streets, and demanding freedom. For the first time in Xi's decade-long rule, public dissent erupted across China. The protests spread from Shanghai to Beijing and beyond, a rare sight in a country where such gatherings are swiftly crushed. It was a test of Xi's authority unlike anything he had faced before. Then, suddenly, the policy was reversed. The lockdowns ended almost overnight, but the damage was done. The economy slowed, youth unemployment rose, and for the first time, whispers of discontent reached even the party's inner circles. Still, Xi remained untouchable. At the 20th National Congress in 2022, he walked out again as China's leader, this time for an unprecedented third term. Behind him stood a Politburo standing committee made up entirely of his loyalists. The last remaining officials connected to his predecessors had been removed. There was no longer any balance, no rival factions, no internal opposition. Xi had done what no one since Mao had achieved: total dominance over China's political system. But absolute power comes with a cost. And as China faces economic strain, global tension, and internal unrest, the question remains: how long can one man hold it all together? Because Xi's rise tells us more than just the story of a single leader. It reveals how power, once lost to history, can return in an even stronger and more unbreakable form. Xi Jinping's story is one of the most extraordinary political journeys of our time. He was born into privilege, stripped of everything, and forced to start again from nothing. He endured humiliation, exile, and years of obscurity, only to rise back through the very system that destroyed his family. For decades, China promised that no one would ever hold absolute power again. Yet today, it stands under the rule of a single man who controls the party, the army, the government, and the nation's future. Xi has rewritten the Communist Party's history, reshaped its ideology, and rebuilt its machinery of power in his own image. To his supporters, he is a symbol of strength, the leader who restored China's pride, expanded its influence, and defended its sovereignty. To his critics, he is a modern emperor, a man reviving the fear and control that once defined Mao's dictatorship. Either way, Xi Jinping has become the defining figure of China's modern era. The boy who once dug trenches in the countryside now commands the world's second-largest superpower. But his story also raises a haunting question. Can a nation truly move forward when its power rests in the hands of one man? Because history has shown that when power becomes absolute, it rarely stays benevolent, and for Xi Jinping, the rise to the top may have been complete, but the struggle to hold it has only just begun.